Today I thought we would do something a little different, and instead of reading a single picture book like we've been doing, I thought it would be fun if I read to you a chapter from this book, and if you like it, you'll have to tell me if you like it or not. If you like it, then I can read more chapters from this book. But I was tidying up my bookshelves, and I found this, and I actually own a couple of copies of this book. But this one I thought about you because this is Sideways Stories from Wayside School, and it's by Louis Sachar. And the reason why I thought about you guys was because when I opened it up, there was a name inscribed on the inside. Can you see it? Can you read what it says? It's in cursive. It says, Tim McCaslin. Who's that? It's your dad. This book used to belong to your dad. Yeah, cool, huh? If he asks me real nice, I might send it to him. I might not, though. All right, well, this is a very funny book. And it's about a school. It's a special school called Wayside School, and the children who live in it. So I'll read you the introduction and chapter 1 today. So, introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and their teachers at Wayside School. Before we get to them, there's something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row, but instead it's 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. Right, hang on a second, because I've got a little dog here that really wants to sit on my lap. Come on, buddy. Okay, go for it. Whoop, there he is. Little Jack's joining us for story time today. All right, the children at Wayside like having a sideways school because they have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It's been said that these stories are strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children of Wayside, they also thought that you were strange and silly. That's probably also true. Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. That's the teacher. What do you think about her? What does she look like? She's got a long pointy nose. Does that mean that she's mean? I hope not, because I've got a long pointy nose. I don't know, though. She looks a little sketchy. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anyone else have an opinion? She asked. No one said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it, but he was scared. I do not allow crying in this classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, then stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. and when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. Guess what happened? He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue, and Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf now had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terence, Mauricia, and the three Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Evans. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back to the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. "Now I can go home," she said. "I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again." "You're not going anywhere," shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. "Stop," she shouted, "or I'll turn you into applesauce." But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. "Turn us back into children," Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned all the apples back into children. "All right," said Mauricia. "Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do." "No," screamed Mrs. Gorf. "I'll turn you back into apples." She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror just in time, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Do you know how to wiggle your ears? We should practice. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. "Where's Mrs. Gorf?" he asked. Nobody said a word. "Boy, am I hungry," said Louis. "I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I took an apple. After all, she always has so many." He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. What'd you think? You'll have to tell me if you want me to keep going with this book. The next chapter is Mrs. Jules. So yeah, tell me if you want me to keep going with this book or go back to the picture books. Or maybe a little bit of both. Love you.